it has given us a stigma that we don't deserve to have.
I just don't think the facts are there. I'd like to see the facts come out.
They were manufacturing a story that didn't exist.
Everything I've ever read about Adolph Rupp seemed to have been written by people who had no idea who Adolph Rupp was.
For a man to be just the opposite of what he's been made, that's not right.
They just wanted to be the first, you know, to integrate the sport.
Everyone's pointing fingers at Adolph Rupp, but I think in the process we're also forgetting about the University of Kentucky and the climate here.
And there was an enormous amount of pressure put on him by some of the local bigots.
At the end of his life, he was progressive, and he even had affection for me.
People who didn't know him went through the myth and the legend and all the rumors more than anything else, and did not go directly to people who knew Adolph.
We had a lot of fun. To those of you that went down the glory road with me, my eternal thanks. Good night.
His parting words of thanks tinged with sorrow. Adolph Rupp wasn't ready to leave his job as the head coach at the University of Kentucky. He was forced to do so by the school's mandatory retirement age.
There's no way he could have known that his image would outlast his legacy of championship basketball. It was an image he no doubt would have hated. Rupp's family and friends find it appalling and heartbreaking. Reporters who covered his program say the story has been kept afloat by journalists who should know better. Here at the UK Basketball Museum, you're surrounded by evidence of the coaching prowess of Adolph Rupp. But through a concurrence of events, he's become known as the Darth Vader of college basketball. People who were there who knew him say it's not fair. And some facts, little known until now, would seem to back that up.
Adolph Rupp built his program at Kentucky in a manner common to coaches of his era, through strength of will, fear, and intimidation.
Were there days that I disliked him? You bet. I mean, there were days that he would scream and yell at me like he did all of his players for the 40-plus years he was there. But at the same time, while he did that, I think he was always looking to improve his team, to make his players better, to certainly win games.
The charisma that he brought, you know, he had had some national championship success and so on when I came along, and you know, it was recognized that he was pretty much the master coach.
I think the reason why he was so successful is because he was probably at that time the hardest working coach in college basketball. He worked very hard to learn, you know, from the master in Fog Allen.
Coach Rupp was a dictator, and you had to be back during that time. The most successful coaches in college sports back during that era were dictators. And you think of Bear Bryant, and you think of Coach Rupp, and you think of Darrell Royal at Texas, and you think of just the many great coaches. They had built these empires, so to speak.
So he had his pick of great players, and he demanded that they be good. Bill Spivey once told me that Adolph wanted all of us to hate him, and he succeeded.
Coach Rupp didn't have much use for anybody who couldn't help Coach Rupp. I mean, he was hard on the writers, he was hard on some of his rival coaches, and he was certainly hard on his players. It's like the quote that somebody once said about Vince Lombardi. He treated us all alike, like dogs. And that's kind of the way Coach Rupp was.
He demanded and commanded respect for his authority, which was a guiding force in his own life.
Being of German parentage, he had this innate respect for authority, but on the other hand, he wanted to have things his way a lot of times, but he always was willing to accept the final decision that was made by his superior in terms of the position at the university.
I think that he gave the impression that he was didn't like you or didn't respect you, whoever you were. That was just his nature. And outside of that, when you were with him one-on-one, he was as personable and charming and and gregarious as he could be.
He was known as a brilliant tactician, and as long as the victories kept piling up, Rupp was comfortable with that description. His ego became the stuff of legend, or at least the occasional anecdote.
Coach Rupp had a very, I'll say this kindly, a very healthy ego. He let you know that who he was. I remember the old famous story about him driving down through western Kentucky somewhere and having to stop and going in, didn't have any money, and he wrote a check, and the guy said that Coach Rupp wrote the check and put Adolph Rupp on there and handed it to him, said, "Do you know who that is?" And the guy says, "I hope it's you," you know. But that was the kind of ego he had. Everybody knew who he was.
Rupp believed that Adolph Rupp was a great coach. You know, he believed that with everything in him, you know, and he proved it. You know, but at the same time, you know, he didn't mind letting you know that he thought he was very good. You know, and that was, again, at a time in history when modesty was thought to be a great attribute. He was not a modest guy. You know, he won 872 games, and his players lost 172.
Like the New York Yankees during the late 40s and 50s, Kentucky was the bane of every underdog, and its powerful coach, the emblem of the team everybody wanted to knock off.
When I had coached 15 or 20 years, and I got in between my 40s and 50s, I understood more what Coach Rupp stood for, and how he treated people, and how he had to have this side about him that you couldn't penetrate. Because if you're not tough in coaching, you will not last. I think now we're in an era where you're not going to see many coaches lasting 30, 40 years. He lasted 42 years, and it's phenomenal.
Under his tutelage, the Kentucky Wildcats became the standard for all of college basketball and a source of immense pride in the Bluegrass State.
He made Kentucky basketball what it is today, because when he came here in 1930, we were in the midst of the Depression. Kentucky was not a rich state. And he gave the people of Kentucky, whether it was as far eastern Kentucky or far western Kentucky, something that they could hang their hat on and say, this is something that we're proud of, this is something that we're better than you at, and that's basketball.
The University of Kentucky, you know, today is a monument because, from a basketball standpoint, because of one person and one person only, and that was the 41 years that Adolph Rupp taught the game of basketball at Kentucky, taught the fans of Kentucky what great basketball was all about, and also taught, you know, I think, a generation of players who became great coaches, you know, how to teach the game that are monuments and in the Hall of Fame right now.
One of the main reasons I had some success in coaching was because of what I learned from Adolph Rupp about basketball, about people, about life. And he was a teacher of people, not basketball. And I just admired him so much, and I will always think, in my mind, that he was the greatest coach ever to coach the game in any sport.
Unlike some of his contemporaries, Rupp could leave his work at the office. Away from the court, he would immerse himself in the world of business, including the cattle he raised on his farm.
I worked to get off of a farm. I had all I wanted as a youngster. Then as soon as I got off the farm, I worked to get a farm of my own so I could get back on the farm. And I decided that I was going to raise Hereford cattle, and I've been in the Hereford business ever since.
He was a voracious reader of more than playbooks and manuals.
People are complex, and I guess you might say that my father was complex in that he was multi-dimensional.
And he was a very deep man. He just didn't say yes and no. He had always had a deep answer for you, and understood Shakespeare and loved Shakespeare and some things like that. I was just amazed at how intelligent he was away from basketball about things in life.
The downside of Rupp's career coincided with one of the most turbulent decades in the history of America, the 1960s. The civil rights movement shook the nation. For some, it was all happening so fast. For others, not fast enough, including the recruitment of black basketball players in the Southeastern Conference.
From the late 1950s on into the 1960s, possibilities were in the air for a new way of life in the South and in the United States. And so, and even when you were a young kid, you saw television. I mean, I saw the Little Rock. We watched the Little Rock Central High affair on television. We watched James Meredith integrating the University of Mississippi. So the idea of there being integration as a possibility was more real than it ever had been.
One of the leaders of the local, well, not local, but I mean, he was actually a national leader of the black community there in Kentucky. Came out in the papers and everything else and told everybody what I should do when my mom told him what he could do.
You got to understand that Kentucky, of course, and still is, SEC basketball. And they just wanted to be the first, you know, to integrate the sport.
I think one of the things that we cannot overlook is that, you know, even though everyone's pointing fingers at Adolph Rupp, but I think in the process we're also forgetting about the University of Kentucky and the climate here, as well as the climate in the city of Lexington. It just was not as progressive as people would like to assume that it was.
In 1966, his Rupp's Runts Ball Club, one of the most popular teams in the history of Kentucky basketball, played Texas Western in the NCAA championship game. The Runts, like every team in the Southeastern Conference, were all white. Texas Western started 5 blacks. The issue of race barely registered at game time, but about 10 years later, journalists began to characterize that game as a turning point in the history of the sport. Eventually, Rupp's name became synonymous not so much with victories and championships, but with resistance to change in the Deep South.
Had Duke played Texas Western, I don't think you would have seen these stories. It was Coach Rupp and everything that people thought he represented that revisionist historians have latched onto and really made, you know, tried to make fact out of fiction, in my opinion.
He was an easy target. Rupp, during the 50s, had sparred with the media during the gambling scandal that engulfed his program, forcing it to shut down for a season.
People thought he was a bad guy. For some reason, they thought he was a bad guy. I mean, he was not, your hail fellow well met. He wanted to beat you, and he wanted to beat you bad, and he wanted to keep beating you bad, and nobody liked it. And he bragged about how bad he was going to do it. Then when he did it, he'd brag about it some more. So nobody liked him. And so they would pin anything on him that they could.
But to those who played for him, coached under him, and reported on his teams, the characterizations never rang true. History, they said, was under revision.
For guys to assume that and not know the way things actually were in the society and in the culture during that time, but to just kind of assume that it was the way it was in the 70s or the 80s or the 90s or when they came along, and that's a very different time frame.
I'm going to tell you, I've been bitter since they brought this stuff up and they waited until he died. The man is the most misunderstood man when it comes to his feelings about races.
So much of what they're saying is not based on real fact, and it's based on hearsay, on their own personal points of view. And I think if they had known the man and had been able to talk to him and understand his point of view, they would understand that he was not a racist. He was a very broad-minded person on the score of racial integration.
I don't think that it was Coach Rupp's decision not to have black players. And I think that if given the opportunity, there's no question, if he knew that the kid could help him win a ball game, that he would have had him.
There wasn't any racism in him. There wasn't. All there was a guy that wanted to win, would take the best players, and I think he was judged on this subject harshly because he was a winner. He was a bigger-than-life character.
To think that he would not recruit somebody and try to bring the best talent to Kentucky, because of the color of their skin it just flies in the face of his competitiveness, for one thing. I mean, I can't imagine why. It's not the same person you know, that I knew.
For a man to be just the opposite of what he's been made, that's not right.
Any attempt to make him a segregationist was just ridiculous.
Coach Rupp would play the devil. He would dance with the devil for Men OW. That's what he was all about. Winning, and his players went to class. That was the bottom line. How you got there, I don't think it mattered. The W is what mattered.
He was a powerful figure, and that's who you blame in many cases. You blame the most powerful figure. He was noted throughout the Southeastern Conference and the United States as a great basketball coach. But here's a program that didn't have black basketball players, so it's easy to make him the villain.
Now, a lot of people talk about him being a racist, and I totally disagree with that. I never, in all the years that I knew him, ever heard him say a derogatory word about any minority, ever. And I was around him a lot, a whole lot. I was around him before I went there. I was around him a lot while I was there, and I was around him a lot after I left. And I never, ever heard him say anything bad.
You know, I think that there was a jump to conclusion on Coach Rupp that because of his demeanor, because of his gruff way, gruff approach, that it just simply fell to the notion that he was a racially prejudiced, and none of us saw that.
There wasn't a racist bone in his body, and I think that anyone who knows me, Dick, and knows how I feel about things, I wouldn't have worked for him if he were a racist. It's that simple.
I keep waiting for someone to show me where Adolph Rupp once acted on the reason of race. Once. Show me. You don't tell me what he said or may have said to somebody third or fourth hand. Show me where he once acted on race.
He gave me a saying during that time: right is right and wrong is wrong.
People that are judging him are not being, some of them weren't even around, weren't even born to begin with, and then here they are writing all these editorials and just what they've picked up or heard through the years.
And what happens, and I'm old enough now to see this, is that once something like that takes hold, then it becomes accepted as gospel. Then it's repeated until finally it does become fact in a lot of people's minds.
But Adolph is totally, I think, misrepresented, you know, in this whole concept when it comes to him being a racist. He was not. I played for him. I know him.
You know, he may have been a lot of things, Dick. He may have, some people said he had a big ego, some said he was a tyrant, some said he was motivated by fear and all that kind of business. And I don't know, but the one thing I am dead sure of is that he was not a racist.
Like so many college coaches, Adolph Rupp's career began on the high school level. In 1926, his Freeport, Illinois team included a black player.
There were only 6 black youngsters in Freeport High School. He did not have to put this young man on the team for any political reasons. He put him on there because he was a basketball player, and my father loved to win, and this young man was a basketball player.
And I came back and asked him, Coach, you had a black kid. So I said, why? He said he could play. That was that simple.
In 1930, Rupp took the job at Kentucky, although he wasn't sure it was a move he wanted to make until he got some advice from a friend.
He was up on a ladder hanging a sign, and he got down off the ladder and he says, Adolph, he says, I'll tell you one thing. You take that job. He said, you can always go to a better job from there than you can from here. You'll never get another chance to coach another university. And while you've got the chance, you'd better take it.
18 years later, he won the first of his 4 NCAA titles in 1948. That was the same year Rupp assisted in the selection process for the U.S. Olympic basketball team. Tryouts were held in Memorial Coliseum, and among the players Rupp chose, Don Barksdale.
This youngster graduates from UCLA, is not allowed to play pro ball because the NBA is not integrated, so he's playing AAU ball, and yet through the tryouts, my father selects him as the first black youngster to participate in basketball in the Olympics for the United States.
I had not seen a lot of black players play other than the Globetrotters at that time. And to see him was an eye-opener for me. He was a great player. And I can remember Coach Rupp during those trials calling attention to other players, his own, Wah Jones and others who were involved in this, that, you know, look at his footwork, watch how he does this, watch how he does that. So Coach Rupp had a great appreciation for his skills as a player.
In 1950, Kentucky high schools were still segregated. Black schools held their own state tournament, which Rupp attended.
We had two state tournaments, black and white, so he attended a session of the black tournament.
He noticed a young player named Jim Tucker, who grew up in nearby Paris, Kentucky, following Rupp and the Wildcats.
Growing up in Kentucky, University was the only basketball team in the country. I think that every time the University of Kentucky played, black or white, the radio was on. We didn't have television back in those days, but my mother would tune in to UK basketball, and the blue and white is what we grew up with.
After Tucker's Paris Western team was eliminated, Rupp asked for and received permission to speak with him.
I knew who he was, and he said to me, I'd like for you to come to Kentucky, but you know our situation here. And but what I'd like to do is contact some of my friends in the coaching community and see if they might have an interest in you, because I think you have the ability to become an All-American and a good basketball player.
One of the teams Rupp contacted was Duquesne. Tucker eventually was accepted to and signed with the Pittsburgh school. His coach, Donald Moore, had never seen him play but trusted in Rupp's recommendation.
He said that if Adolph Rupp recommends you, that's the only reason we showed the interest, because if he couldn't have you, then we'd like to.
Tucker eventually did play for Rupp in a two-game All-Star series.
I had a lot of respect for him. I had a lot of respect for his basketball team. I respect his position, not fully realizing, you know, what was going on behind the scenes. And I believe that had he had the opportunity and the support of the school at that time, he would have had black players.
Tucker went on to become an All-American at Duquesne, which, ironically enough, in 1953 bumped Kentucky from the top spot in the Associated Press college basketball poll. Duquesne wasn't the only college signing black players, but the major schools that did were predominantly Northern. Rupp, who knew talent when he saw it, began to consider taking what, for the basketball institution in the Southeastern Conference, would be a powerful and dramatic step. In 1960, he contacted a Cincinnati high school coach, who was also a UK scout, and asked him to appraise two immensely talented future Hall of Famers.
He asked me a question, who did I think was better, Oscar Robertson or Jerry West? And I immediately said Oscar Robertson, and he got a big grin on his face. And he said, would you be interested in coming to Lexington and helping us? Because we're going to be recruiting black youngsters. And it's only correct, and I want somebody who feels comfortable in their homes.
In 1958, Kentucky would win its fourth national championship under Rupp with an overachieving team known as the Fiddlin' Five. But by the early 60s, the basketball Wildcats couldn't live up to the standards they'd set. From 1959 through 64, they won just one outright SEC championship and shared another. The University of Kentucky campus had been desegregated for several years, but still there were no black student athletes allowed in the conference. SEC institutions adhered to a gentleman's agreement, no recruitment of African Americans. The sports media were silent. They, too, were a product of their time.
You know, I'm 30 years older now. Certainly now I'm a different person than I was 30 years ago. You know, I'm much more in tune with that than then. Then all I cared about was finding the ballpark, watching the game, and writing a story about it. You know, I had very few issues that had anything to do outside the arena.
UK President Dr. Frank Dickey sought to change that.
We were able to break down the barriers for the students to attend the University of Kentucky. We were the first institution in the South to permit students to, Afro-American students to come. And we should be among the first when athletics was concerned.
In 1957, he polled the SEC institutions about the possibility of recruiting black athletes. And in 1961, while he was taking his turn as president of the conference, he approached his athletics director, Bernie Shively, football coach Charlie Bradshaw, and Rupp, and told them he was going to ask the league to formally approve a move to desegregate its athletic teams. He wanted their blessing, and he got it.
Rupp's one statement, though, was he said, I do not want to be pushed too fast in this because I need to have the first player or first few recruits that we get to be successful in order that they will not harm the efforts toward integration and that they will not harm themselves. And he said, to do this, he said, I think we have to look for a person who is a good team player and a person who is able to maintain his academic standing and retain his eligibility.
The motion Dickey set before the SEC was resoundingly rejected.
I think there was only one school at that time that said, yes, we will go along with you on this. The others said, if you do move in that direction, we're going to have to drop you from our schedule because we cannot guarantee that when you come to our home court, you will be safe or that you would be given any sort of welcome. And they said, obviously, the Afro-Americans on their squad would have to sleep and eat someplace else, and said, we don't think that's good, and we didn't either.
Black leaders in Lexington who'd seen the proliferation of African-American athletes at Northern institutions took note of the fact that UK chose to maintain its membership in the all-white SEC.
There were things that I think that that the University of Kentucky did not do, that they could have done, that could have clearly, staked out a position in terms of where, the university stood on this very moral issue. And, we just did not take the moral leadership that we should have in terms of, sort of setting a standard, for the SEC. For example, we stayed in the league. You see what I'm saying? That's when you really demonstrate that you're firmly standing on your position.
He was willing to tell the SEC, along with Dr. Dickey. Back in the late 50s, he was going to leave the SEC.
It was a move Rupp privately considered.
We had no problem. He always said, we don't need it. Football may need it, but he didn't think football needed it either.
Coach Rupp would have had to probably leave the Southeastern Conference had he integrated in the early days of integration. You got to remember what was happening throughout the South at that time. Mississippi State not being able to play in an NCAA championship and then having to sneak out because they were going to have to play against a black player. Other things happening in the Deep South. Alabama, for example, 63, the Governor Wallace stands in the schoolhouse door to keep blacks from entering the university. Now, how are you going to take, at the University of Kentucky, how are you going to take a black player into Tuscaloosa to play?
Dickey said he considered the move, but with the school having just built a new basketball facility, playing a schedule minus traditional SEC opponents was a financial risk they couldn't afford to take.
The attendance would have dwindled, and the ability to pay off the bonds, which was another moral obligation of the university, would have been in jeopardy. And so when I brought this to both the athletic board and to the board of trustees, they said this has to be considered and it has to come first to be able to meet the obligations of the university to the bondholders.
In the end, Rupp acquiesced to the wishes of his superior. Asked about it at the end of his career, he was defensive.
Oh, I've had the people tell me, you're a big man. I was surprised at you. I was disappointed in you. Why didn't you drop out of the conference? Well, now, Adolph Rupp doesn't drop out of the conference. I don't determine the policies of the University of Kentucky, and I never did. And when they say that I should have refused to play the Southeastern Conference teams, I don't refuse to play Southeastern Conference teams. I play the conference teams that the university says I must play.
Even though the league had voted down the proposition, word spread quickly throughout the South that the University of Kentucky had sought to desegregate the conference.
Forget the basketball. Forget the player. It was important to him for a social issue. It was only right. As he said, it's only right. We're the Commonwealth of Kentucky, and every citizen and every student and a basketball player of every school should be able to come and play at the University of Kentucky.
The backlash found its way to Lexington.
Dear Mr. Dickey, your willingness to integrate athletic teams in the Southeastern Conference is repugnant and sickening. If you wish to dishonor the University of Kentucky in such a manner, you should at least have the decency to abstain from influencing other schools to choose the same shameful course. If you wish to surrender the dignity of Kentucky to the NAACP and other lawless and rabble-rousing gangs, why don't you withdraw from the conference and let other schools do as they wish? The sickening thing being forced on free citizens is a crime against the white race and a disgrace to decency. The letter was signed Presley J. Snow of Philadelphia, Mississippi.
My dear Dickie Bird, hasn't the integration in Louisville paused? Seems to me I read where it's less than when initiated. Please write me, and do try to keep the South at least white. The unsigned letter was sent from Richmond, Virginia.
Dear Mr. Dickey, my heart and my mind are so burdened with the tragic and unnecessary circumstances that will eventually lead us to chaos and disaster unless something isn't done to prevent it. I cannot refrain from pleading that you do all within your power to enforce racial segregation, to prevent the awful catastrophe that will befall us if a halt is not called. My heart aches especially for our innocent, helpless youth, for if they are forced to have to associate with Negroes, that will lead occasionally to intermarriage. And what could possibly be worse? Let each race live among themselves according to God's plan. The letter was signed, Sincerely yours, a distressed mother.
Rupp and Reed received several death threats, which were forwarded to the FBI.
I had 12 absolute, no question about it, death threats that were turned over to the FBI. And Mr. Rupp I know he had above 120. We'd open up the mail. Of course, Mr. Rupp got meant more than me, but then he'd call me in and say, this one's for you.
And not all of it came from well below the Mason-Dixon line.
This isn't going to sit well with some people, probably, but I think you have to recognize, too, that not only was there racism, pretty strong racism in the South during that time. There was some pretty strong racism in the state of Kentucky. You know, you can ask anybody that grew up in Louisville during that time of integration, or anybody in eastern Kentucky where there were very few blacks, or in western Kentucky where there were practically no blacks. And it was a time of you know, where racism was not an abstract. You know, people think of Kentucky as being a border state and so on, but it's far from being void of racism. Matter of fact, and I don't know that I've ever said this publicly, but it doesn't matter, some of the worst hate mail I got when I integrated the program at Alabama came out of Louisville, Kentucky, which was shocking to me.
Rupp was not oblivious to the potential dangers of integration. For years, he had witnessed the animosity hurled at his all-white Kentucky teams throughout the South.
He said, what would you do to have me take these black kids down south? Now, he said, you've been going on trips with us. You can see the colored water fountains, the restrooms, the theaters, and all that, and you see how we're treated with our white players. What do you think would happen with the black players? And he had a point there.
You go to Auburn and places like that. I mean, it was rough being on Kentucky team, being all white. I mean, they hated us, Mississippi State and Auburn and places like that.
How was he going to take that player down to Oxford, Mississippi, or to Auburn, Alabama? You know, when they wouldn't let him stay in hotels, you know, they wouldn't let him eat in, you know, in restaurants and stuff. And you know, well, I heard a lot of stuff about that. He was very concerned about having somebody come to a team and be threatened or get hurt or physically abused or verbally abused, and he really spoke out about that a lot.
So the notion of taking the hated Wildcats on the road with black players was not made without serious consideration.
He had to take his players down there. We'd take the white players down there, and they would abuse them, especially in Starkville, Mississippi. I mean, like Cotton Nash, out of bounds, people sitting there pulling the hair off his legs, and all kind of abuse the white players took. And he said, what would we do if we took our black players down there if we had any? So that preyed on his mind. Where would you feed them? Where would you house them? And that type of thing.
We weren't a group of people that were, beloved by anybody else in the conference. I mean, they hated us, because we had been so successful.
They hated us. No. We'd go down there and play. They hated us.
Rupp had hired Reed as a full-time assistant because Reed had coached and taught black youngsters at the high school level. He said even though the league and a vocal portion of fans resisted integration, they never gave up on the idea. They just had to proceed at a different pace.
We were kind of by ourselves. And did a lot of commiserating. We were on the highway a lot and did a lot of commiserating. But he understood. And he understood you can't change a culture. It was happening so fast.
Dickey left the university in 1963, but not before restating his support for integrating the SEC. And he found an ally in the school newspaper. The Kentucky Colonel advocated the signing of black athletes. In an editorial, the Colonel said if UK was not allowed to proceed, it should leave the conference. Southern newspapers responded.
Adolph Rupp, relegated to an also-ran status most every year in the Southeastern Conference basketball race, which he once dominated, has agitated for the chance to recruit Negro players. Now he's been joined by the University of Kentucky student newspaper. The Colonel goes the barren one step, though. It wants out of the SEC to boot, which is perfectly all right here. Written by Lee Baker in the Jackson, Mississippi Daily News in February of 1963.
We see where the editor of the University of Kentucky student newspaper has advocated the withdrawal of the university from the Southeastern Conference for the expressed purpose of recruiting Negro athletes. We have been deceived for many years by the fact that Kentucky is a Southern university. Just what makes them think that they know anything about the South? The editor says he is sick and tired of the doctrine of racial inferiority being rammed down our throats. It is not the doctrine of racial inferiority that has been rammed down the throats of Kentucky, but the foul taste of defeat on the football field year in and year out. Written by Eddie Dean in the Columbus, Mississippi Commercial Dispatch in March of 1963.
It was a time when we wanted to move faster than we were able to, we'll put it that way, and that's always a distressing sort of situation.
In 1963, the country was boiling. African Americans had found a national voice in Martin Luther King, whose letter from Birmingham jail urged his followers to disobey unjust laws. In May of that year, Birmingham police used fire hoses and attack dogs on black demonstrators. 2.5 months after the murder of NAACP Field Secretary Medgar Evers, King delivered his I Have a Dream speech in Washington, D.C. Less than 3 weeks later, another tragedy made national headlines. 4 little girls murdered in a church firebombing in Selma, Alabama. During the 63-64 school year, young men on college campuses discussed and debated the civil rights movement, but another topic took precedence. Vietnam.
That was probably the overriding factor on campus when I was in school at the University of Kentucky, because we were intimately involved in what was going to happen in that war in Southeast Asia, because we could be going over there.
Rupp concerned himself with his basketball team, still looking for that first black signee. And he believed the first African American ever to play for the Wildcats would have to be special both on and off the floor.
I think he envisioned that the first black player coming into his program needed to be an Alex Groza, or needed to be a Ralph Beard, or needed to be a Cliff Hagan or a Frank Ramsey. And I think for that reason, perhaps, they missed out on some kids who, obviously had a lot of other places they could go, very highly recruited and so on. And yet he wanted that first player to be one to come in and know that he could succeed on the court as well as off the court.
Through his friend, former baseball commissioner Happy Chandler, Rupp sought advice from someone who'd walked a similar path. Branch Rickey, the man who'd signed Jackie Robinson, the first African-American in the modern history of the major leagues.
I wrote down what he said. The first thing he said, that the youngster you take must be a Kentuckian, must be an excellent student, must be without question, as with Jackie. Nobody's going to keep him on the bench. Going to be something, especially if it's something you need. And boy, we needed centers.
Rupp thought he had found his man, Wesley Unseld, a powerful 6'7" center who led Louisville Seneca to back-to-back Kentucky State championships.
There was no finer youngster. And we had great youngsters. I said no finer, because we had great youngsters. I don't think any of them were finer than another. But there is no finer person, certainly not a player, which he proved how good he was.
I told Coach Rupp, I said, you know what? I said, I think we really ought to try to recruit him. I said, could I make a trip down there to talk to him? He says, absolutely. So I drove to Louisville, went down, sat down with him, and really tried to get him to come to the University of Kentucky. I said, Wes, if you'll come, I said, I think we got a chance to win a national championship.
He was a great, great player. I played against him a couple of times when he was at Seneca and I was at Lafayette, and he was not only a great player. I mean, he was just a great person.
All the kids wanted him. They're not stupid. When anybody could rebound like him, I mean, he led the NBA in rebounding.
If Wes Unseld had been our center on that 66 team, how good would we have been? I mean, we'd have been 2 games better, I can tell you that. But this was a player that was a very unique individual.
Unseld's academic record, like his play under the boards, was rock solid.
And athletically, I was probably the top recruit in the country. So there was pressure from the black community, the black civil rights leaders, local civil rights leaders, for me to do this, to go to Kentucky and to be the first in the SEC. And, most people don't know I was the first in the ACC being recruited, too.
According to one of the myths surrounding Unseld's recruitment, he was introduced at a Kentucky game in Memorial Coliseum and was roundly booed. Truth is, Unseld was booed in the Coliseum as he and his Seneca teammates played in the state tournament.
Wes was booed at the game, and it's been said that that was a racial thing, but it wasn't. It was just a typical state tournament crowd pulling for the little underdog, Breckinridge County. And the evidence of that is that Breckinridge County had more African-American starters than Seneca did.
His team was booed by the fans, but it wasn't because he was black. It was simply because the mountain teams wanted to defeat the team from Louisville. And in those days, the Louisville teams were tremendous basketball teams.
That was partly because we were from Louisville. We were a big school. We were playing a small school. I think a lot of that had to do with that. And then there was, of course, the rumors that I might be going to Kentucky.
It was easy to see why Unseld would believe some didn't want him at UK.
I started getting the threats in the mail and the dead chickens and all that kind of stuff.
In the early 1960s, I mean, that was dangerous. That was dangerous when you talk about, because one, when you look at the University of Kentucky, there was always a tremendous amount of hostility awaiting, the players from the University of Kentucky when they arrived at some of these SEC schools. But, one can only anticipate, how that hostility would have been elevated with the presence of a black player. Obviously, that was a concern. But, I don't want to, overlook the fact that, that hostility was also very present on the University of Kentucky's campus.
Still, Rupp persisted in his own way. Today, head basketball coaches spend nearly as much time on the road recruiting as they do in the gym. Back then, Rupp sent representatives to scout Unseld and to talk to him and his family.
I never spoke to Lancaster. I never spoke to Rupp. And everyone, especially my high school and around, kept saying that if they really wanted me, I would have talked to Rupp and I would have heard from Lancaster. They would have been on my doorstep.
Getting Mr. Rupp out of Lexington was like, it was near impossible.
He didn't go on a lot of recruiting trips now. Yeah. He believed that the mountains come through Mohammed.
Finally, under pressure from the Louisville newspaper, Rupp set up his own in-home visit. It happened to be on the same day Wesley had scheduled a speaking engagement.
We tried at that time to get him to set another date, and he said that he didn't need to talk to me. He wanted to meet with my parents, which was quite common with college, coaches coming in and talk. So we said, oh, that would be great. And I waited to say hello to him and introduce him to my mother and father, and they went in to talk, and I left.
By all accounts, the visit with Unsel's parents went smoothly.
We went into his home. Were treated fairly nice by he and his mother and by his father.
But Reed said afterwards Rupp had a bad feeling about it.
Mr. Rupp, we got in the car, and then Mr. Rupp said, he's not coming. I said, why? And he said, well, anybody would miss anything to spend some time with me.
And even though he knew prior to the trip that the youngster would not be there for the entire in-home visit, Rupp couldn't resist making a comment about it to a Louisville newspaper.
A day or two later, it was in the paper that I didn't have the courtesy to meet with him.
Who said that?
Rupp. So I figured he didn't really want me there, and there was no sense in me kidding myself.
One afternoon during the recruitment of Unseld, Rupp found himself in his office facing about a dozen boosters, including a former UK basketball All-American. They belittled Unseld's academic and athletic abilities and urged Rupp not to sign him or any other blacks.
They started in, and he said, I could see him getting angry. Thought it was back at some of those locker rooms after games. He looked around that room and pointed that finger of his, and he said, I want all you son of a bitchin' bastard racists out of this office and don't ever come back. And I don't care if they told him that he could have their season tickets. He said, give me your season tickets. They'll last about as long as a guy can drive down here from Toledo. And he said, you give me I don't want you in the Coliseum. You shouldn't be there.
It was a permanent separation.
They never spoke to him again, and he never spoke to them. Ever. Ever.
Reed later took UK President John Oswald to visit the Unselds, but it was no use. Wes Unseld, who now lives in Baltimore, where he and his wife own and operate a private elementary school, says he knew early that he likely would not be the first African-American to break the racial barrier in either the SEC or the ACC.
I realized that I probably wasn't the type that would have served everybody's purpose in a situation like that, because my mentality was probably a little different in that if you spit in my face, I probably would spit back in your face. I don't know if I was the type that would have turned around and walked away.
Unseld's mother wanted assurances from Coach Rupp that if he came to UK, that Coach Rupp would be able to protect him. And Coach Rupp would not make that promise. And I think that was a very honorable thing for him to do, because he couldn't protect him. The year that Unseld was a senior at Seneca, 1964, was the year that the 3 civil rights workers were killed, murdered in Mississippi.
People during the 60s, they didn't want their kids going to Louisiana and Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia and playing. We were killing people, burying them in earthen dams, if you remember, blowing up black churches. It was a disgrace.
When I went to talk to him, the words he said to me still ring in my ears. He said, Larry, I don't want to be the first black person to go play in the South. And you know what? I understood that. I fully understood that, because it was a difficult time back then.
Unseld went on to a Hall of Fame career at the University of Louisville and the NBA. Rupp kept searching. By 1965, the pressure on Rupp had increased considerably. Dr. John Oswald had been on the job just more than a year as university president. To make certain UK qualified for federal funding, he had stepped up efforts to integrate the campus, both in academics and athletics. Rupp had made no secret of the fact that he was willing to accept a black player, and the rest of the SEC took note.
People, I think, thought that Kentucky should have been, or Coach Rupp should have been a pioneer because of his influence and his name. And yet it really wasn't in Coach Rupp's nature at his age, I think, to want to be a social pioneer, a guy that was going to, but the one thing that would have made him, and that finally convinced him to recruit African Americans, was that they could help him win.
Polling the conference and asking them if it's all right with them, and just getting that response from the northern schools. And they all felt that Kentucky should be the one to break the barrier.
Dr. Oswald's opinion was that he wanted all of the departments integrated regardless of ability. In those days, the term was referred to as a token black. And this is what Dr. Oswald was wanting. He was wanting my father to put a black youngster on the team regardless of whether he could play basketball or not.
Rupp balked at Oswald's urgings, instead insisting on selecting a black who fit the same sort of academic and athletic criteria as Wes Unseld in order to ensure success of the individual and the team.
He said, people say I'm a mean old man, and maybe I am, but I'm not mean enough to put some kid at the end of the bench just to be a token. He said, I'm not about to do that.
My father felt that it was important that the youngster play, that he be able to represent the university as a basketball player, that he was spending Commonwealth money on a youngster that should be able to earn it by being able to play and not just sit on the end of the bench and say, well, we have a black youngster on the team who can't play, doesn't know anything about basketball, and that's where they came to their differences.
He couldn't do that. He wouldn't do that. To have a token black, to have somebody whose feelings would be hurt, or, you know, or their parents, you know, would feel the same thing, and so he wouldn't do that. If he was going to recruit anybody, that player was going to be able to play.
Not decorate the bench. No, that's what he said. He doesn't want one just to sit on the bench. He wants somebody who can play. Well, the white guys, pardon my language, but he wanted those that could play also.
The worst thing he felt that could happen at this time was if he did recruit a black player or a black youngster who could not play, and the youngster was on the end of the bench and he was unhappy, and then all the people that were for this happening were unhappy, and the kid could not play, and he was just sitting there wasting time, and then they would say, well, look, he won't play the youngster.
Once again, Rupp thought he'd found his man, Butch Beard, who led Breckinridge County to the 1964 finals and the 65 Sweet 16 championship.
There was no question about it. As a matter of fact, if any of these critics of Coach Rupp would take the time to do it, they can go back and find in Sports Illustrated a story by Frank DeFord that ran in June of 1965 where he lauded Kentucky for leading the integration of Southern basketball, because everybody was convinced at that time that Butch Beard was coming to UK.
There were no black players in the Southeastern Conference. Butch Beard would have been the first. Sports Illustrated wrote about what a great thing it was that Kentucky was recruiting Butch Beard.
It was the alumni that at UK was really pushing for this to happen, okay? I had verbally said, I think I would give it a shot, all right? They had told me that there would be a possibility that one of my teammates would come along, so I would have somebody with me. My high school coach and I, we talked about it.
There was a lot to ponder for a 17-year-old faced with the prospect of becoming the first black to play major college basketball in the Deep South, where signs of oppression were still painfully apparent.
I do remember traveling in the South to Southeastern Conference meets, and I can remember plain as day in Birmingham, Alabama, Montgomery, Alabama, excuse me, that somewhere near the track facility we were going to run, there was the official headquarters of the Ku Klux Klan, and big sign. And I remember signs about colored people
you know, and that in restaurants and stuff.
You didn't know what was coming. You know, we had always had to be on guard.
UK track star Jim Green, a world-class sprinter, was the first black athlete ever to graduate from an SEC institution.
I remember one time, I think we were going through Mississippi one time, and the coach said, "Oh, you gotta get down in the seat because the Klan is having a march."
A multi-sports star in high school, Green said Rupp asked him to play basketball, but his track schedule was just too demanding. Green had been the same sort of pioneer Rupp was hoping Beard would become.
When Coach Rupp was talking about that he could not guarantee my safety in the South, I had to think about that. And let's be honest, now here's where you can call him whatever you want to call him. And maybe he was trying to scare me off. I don't know. But at least I think he was honest in the fact that he told my family and me that I don't know if I can guarantee his safety. And so therefore, at least he was up front there with that, because he could have lied and made me feel like that it had been okay and something may have happened, you know, when we traveled in the South.
You have to remember what was going on in Mississippi and Alabama in 1964, 65, 66. The Ku Klux Klan could do whatever it wanted to. You couldn't protect an African-American player. If they wanted to kill him, they'd find a way to do it.
It was a dangerous thing. It wasn't just a matter of, I'm going to be uncomfortable playing basketball. I mean, this was going to be a dangerous thing.
As I made it known that I had interest in the University of Kentucky, it got to be real crazy for a 17-year-old in a small community, okay? There were people who would come up and knock on my door, never seen them before in my life. "I want you to go to the University of Kentucky, you would be good." There were people who come up and drop the N-word on me and say, "If you go, we're gonna hang your ass," and walk off, okay? So now as a 17-year-old, you're trying to figure all this out.
It wasn't his first brush with racism. As an 8th grader, Beard was going door to door selling Christmas cards to help raise traveling funds for his basketball team. He stopped at the house of a white teammate where Beard's aunt worked as a domestic, and he decided to try to make a sale.
I knocked on their front door. The mother came up and said, "Don't you ever knock on my front door again. You come to my back." Okay? Now, I walked off, and when my aunt came home, I asked her, "Why do you work for her? You know, why do you work for her?" You know, I knew she needed the money, but why? And in a way, you know, I know she thought she was doing the right thing, all right? I had to endure that because I played with her son for the next 4 years, knowing that this happened.
That was still in his mind when Adolph Rupp came to call.
He had a marvelous time at Butch's house. He loved it. He had a great time with Butch's mother. He had a great time with Butch. And then we went down to the barber shop. And I thought, we got to get going. We were there a long time. We were there hours. And he was, put him on the stage and look out.
Coach Rupp came to my house a couple of times. I didn't feel comfortable with him, okay? Now, you know, he's been labeled everything from a racist to whatever. As a 17-year-old country boy, I had to feel at least comfortable in that situation because as my mother asked him about going to Tennessee and Alabama and Mississippi, he made some comments that I listened to. It wasn't like he says, well, you know, we're not going to take care of your son, Mrs. Beard. I just didn't know if he wanted to fight that particular battle at that time.
It was a matter of life, maybe death for Butch Beard to not go to Kentucky. Adolph Rupp had nothing to do with Kentucky not breaking the race barrier before anybody else. He wanted to do it.
On the first day recruits could sign a national letter of intent, UK hosted Beard and his high school coach, Don Morris, on campus. He was the guest at a dinner at Spindletop Hall, attended by boosters, former UK players, and 5 living governors. he met the Kentucky football and basketball players. The coaches were certain they had their man.
Saturday, I dropped him off at the Phoenix Hotel. And I said, well, I think you know now that Mr. Rupp and the people of the university, the people of the Commonwealth want you here, Butch. Because he did have a question, I'm sure. He came from Wes about, but, and then he started crying. And I thought it was tears of joy. I thought it was just tears of joy. And he said, Coach, I signed at Louisville yesterday morning. And I was in shock.
My father, I had gotten with him, and he said, well, what are you going to do? He says, you know, you're going to have to make a decision. Otherwise, this is going to drive you crazy. And it says it's going to drive us crazy. And so as we were there the night before, I told him, I said, look, I think I'm going to go ahead and go to U of L. I said, I'm going to go to U of L because it's closer to home. You and Mom can get up. You know, you can come up and stay. We had an aunt up there. You can come up and stay with Aunt Queen, you know, and I think that's what I'm going to do.
Butch, I think, was more interested in being a Pioneer and was going to be the Pioneer until at the last minute he got cold feet and changed his mind.
I knew Wes. I had spent some time in '64 when we were at the state tournament. We were, like I said, in the same hotel. They were across the hall from me, and I had gotten to know him a little bit. And so to me, it was easier going with what I knew than going to the unknown.
Rupp was convinced Louisville had signed Beard prematurely, but his protests were ignored.
Coach Rupp got on the phone to the commissioner of the Missouri Valley. He just laughed in Coach Rupp's face. And since Coach Rupp was not the most popular guy with the NCAA or anybody else he beat all the time, nobody helped him. Nobody helped him. And he got no help from the SEC office.
It was Butch Beard's choice not to go to Kentucky. It wasn't Adolph Rupp's choice to not have Butch Beard. He wanted Butch Beard. Mr. Basketball in Kentucky, he wanted him. He recruited him. Butch Beard didn't want to be the first black player going to Alabama and Mississippi and Louisiana, where bad things happen to black people.
Later that year, in the summer of '65, the University of Kentucky would become the first integrated football team in the history of the Southeastern Conference, signing Louisville prep star Nat Northington. The following year, 1966, was a defining one for basketball at the University of Kentucky, the SEC, and African Americans everywhere. In 1966, Texas Western came seemingly out of nowhere to win the NCAA championship. But one of the more unlikely teams to be involved in the Final Four that year was Kentucky, picked to finish third or fourth in the Southeastern Conference, coming off a 15-10 season with no player taller than 6'5". But new assistant coach Joe B. Hall convinced Adolph Rupp to allow him to implement a challenging preseason conditioning program, which paid off when it was time to begin practice.
As a result of that program, we hit the floor that year stronger than we've ever been and in better shape.
When he came in, he started a running program that we basically started as soon as we got back to school, which all of us just hated.
Consequently, we literally ran over teams.
The Wildcats ripped off an incredible run, winning 23 of 24 regular season games.
These guys were warriors, boy. They'd fight you to the death, you know, and they had great pride in Kentucky, and it was just a fun team to watch.
We just took off. We were a team that started the season, nobody had any hopes for, and we just took off, and we won our first 10, 11, 12 games by big margins, and then boom, it became a fantasy year.
They beat Dayton and Michigan in the NCAA Mideast Regional in Iowa City and then headed for College Park, Maryland, site of the Final Four. The top-ranked Wildcats had a date with second-ranked Duke.
The Duke game was the featured game of that tournament. We were ranked number 1, they were ranked number 2. And the word was out, whoever won that game would walk into the championship.
I think a lot of our fans, and I think other fans in the country, felt like that was the big matchup. And then once you know, once we beat Duke, that the national championship was going to kind of be an afterthought.
Kentucky prevailed, but the victory drained the Wildcats. Larry Conley, who'd been stricken with the flu in Iowa City, was weak and dehydrated. Pat Riley had been playing with a painful case of athlete's foot. They had less than 24 hours to prepare for the national championship game.
Yeah, I had the flu. Yeah, Pat Riley had an infected toe and couldn't run very well. But you know what? When you're playing for a national championship, you look past all that. I mean, you've got to. You just put it aside. You go out and you play.
Larry did have the flu, and they were kind of up all night with him, giving him IVs and taking care of him. And we got into the arena next night, and it was like, okay, guys, this is it. This is your final game.
In 1966, the semifinals were played on a Friday and the championship game on a Saturday, with no off day or media opportunities in between.
None of these things that happen today, and I don't mean it disrespectful, but the circus-type atmosphere where they have all the press conferences and all the build-up and all that they have today didn't exist in those days.
In the years since, Kentucky versus Texas Western has been framed as the moment in time when college basketball changed forever, a black starting five beating an all-white traditional power. But there were virtually no mentions of it before or after the game.
It seemed to be such a sensitive topic that you brought it up only at your own risk. And a sports page at that time didn't seem to be the place to bring it up.
I mean, obviously, you can look out on the floor and you know, your eyes don't deceive you, but race was not an issue in that game at the time.
I didn't know who they were. None of us knew who they were. And we found out later that they were a very good team.
It wasn't about that. It was simply about trying to win an NCAA championship. And it wasn't until years later that all of a sudden people made a big deal of it.
There was nothing racial about that game. It was never mentioned. In fact, we beat Michigan 2 games before. We played them. They had Cassie Russell and a couple others. And so as I even asked Larry Conley at one time when I saw him, I said, did I miss something? You know, because you started reading about it. And he said, no, there was nothing said racially.
I'm sure there's some people that, you know, and that's for other people. If that's the way they feel, that's the way they feel. From my perspective, it was a basketball game that was a pretty exciting game, pretty exciting time, getting to play in the championship game in the NCAA, someplace I never thought I would be.
We were trying to win a ball game, and we had played against teams previous that had a number of black players on them. You know, not any in the SEC, of course, but we had played against throughout the season, so it wasn't a unique experience to do that.
Kentucky had been a national team, really. They Coach Rupp would take them to Madison Square Garden in New York or Chicago Stadium or New Orleans. They were definitely the program, the class program in college basketball.
He was the greatest coach, the greatest basketball university in the country. And they had all white guys at a time when universities, other basketball programs were being integrated.
African Americans who were developing more and more of a voice in the 60s did notice.
We just see in black and white. And consciously and subconsciously, we see in black and white. And so, you know, it was very apparent. It was very apparent when you looked into the crowd and you saw, you know, a predominantly white crowd, and you saw the Confederate flag there. When you looked around press row, and then you see these 5 black guys in these orange uniforms, you know, sort of sashaying out real coolly and calmly to play against these 5 white guys, and knowing the history of the University of Kentucky.
In a book about the evolution of Sports Illustrated called The Franchise, author Michael McCambridge quoted writer Frank DeFord, who in 1966 covered the Kentucky-Texas Western game. According to McCambridge, DeFord had been granted access to the Kentucky locker room. At halftime, he wrote, DeFord allegedly heard Rupp use racial epithets to describe the Texas Western players. He talked that way all the time, DeFord reportedly said. The comments never appeared in anything DeFord wrote, as they were understood to be off the record, according to the book. DeFord politely declined our request for an interview, saying the Kentucky-Texas Western game has been so misrepresented from what happened at the time that I just decided not to talk about it anymore. The Runts adamantly deny hearing Rupp use language so specifically offensive.
I never heard him say anything like that, okay? I mean, I cannot recall, I mean, if I could, I would tell you, I cannot recall that, all right? I recall him, you know, calling people a lot of things, but I don't remember that.
Coach Rupp never let anybody in that locker room except the team and the officials that were with the university. I mean, there were times he wouldn't even let the president of the university in the locker room.
After their college careers ended, both Conley and Cron developed friendships with DeFord. And while they deny hearing Rupp's comments, they defend his credibility.
I think Frank is an honorable reporter, if he said he was in the locker room, I'm sure he was.
If Frank said he was in there, I'm not going to dispute that, because I think Frank is a gentleman. I've known him for a long time, but I certainly don't remember him being in there.
Texas Western won the game 72-65. Adolph Rupp was denied a 5th national championship.
There were a lot of people at that time who thought that, you know, he's getting old, let's put him on the shelf. He's out of touch with players. And for him to come back that year, it rejuvenated him. I mean, he got that fire back in his belly again. I mean, he really wanted it badly.
Eventually, Rupp was linked by some basketball historians to this game as a sinister presence.
Rupp was larger than life. He made himself an easy target. And people have taken the historical truth that a team starting 5 black players from Texas beat a team starting 5 white players from Kentucky, and have made that into Adolph Rupp was a racist. That's a logical progression that is illogical. Makes no sense to me in any way. You know, it was a coincidence of time.
He got tagged with that, and it grew and it grew and it grew. And then he probably, with his stubbornness and so on, he probably did very little to explain it away. I think he just kind of got hung with that tag.
In fact, many believe Kentucky and its coach would have been better off losing to Duke in the national semifinal game.
I always wondered what would have happened if we'd lost and Duke had played Texas Western. Would they have been pointed out as being segregationists?
First thing I think, what if Duke had beat us and played it? They wouldn't have had a Simon Legree, so to speak.
And I always said the worst thing that ever happened to Coach Rupp was beating Duke, because had Duke won that game, there's no way that Duke ever would have been the lightning rod that Kentucky was.
You look at it and you say, yeah, I'm really sorry that it has that taint to it. You know, really I do, because I would rather Texas Western just assume the national championship and Kentucky finish second, and that would be the end of it. But it was not to be.
For the players involved, their memories of that game are forever linked to more than the joy of earning a shot at a national championship.
I'm very proud of what we did that year. I'm very proud that we got there. I'm disappointed that we didn't bring the title home. The controversy is a separate issue. It wasn't there at the time, so I mean it wasn't a part of that game for me.
We get a lot of notoriety being runner-up in the Rupp's runs, so no, it doesn't take anything away, except just wish we would have won.
How many people get a chance to play on a basketball team that's ranked #1 in the country all year long, okay? How many people get a chance to play in the Final Four? How many people get a chance to play in the championship game? How many people really get a chance to win one, you know? It's not a large group of people.
It's proved to be a very important milestone in the growth of and the proliferation of the black athlete and particularly the black basketball player in this country. That's a significant issue to be involved in that game. But back then, it wasn't part of it, so it hasn't tarnished anything for me.
The controversy will be there forever. I mean, I don't think it'll ever go away because it has been built up. It is now a fixture among basketball people, that national championship game, and it is ingrained in the mind of everybody who ever was around at that point.
Regardless of how it was perceived then and now, the Texas Western-Kentucky game did mark a turning point in college basketball recruiting.
After that 1966 game, that's when the SEC schools, You know, all of them, really, everybody went after black players. That's when even universities became more desegregated. That's when change really took place.
In 1965, Rupp and his staff became interested in a player from Nashville. His name was Perry Wallace. In '66, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Vanderbilt all made recruiting pitches to the all-star forward.
Obviously, everybody knew how great UK was and you know, as a basketball powerhouse. But what happened was that Coach Rupp was conspicuously absent. In addition, information flowed through the black grapevine about Wes Unseld and Butch Beard, people who had been recruited by the University of Kentucky. And the word was that Coach Rupp was not active in recruiting them and was not really willing to talk to the parents to at least say that he's willing to, you know, stand behind their son in Mississippi and Alabama in the Deep South.
Of course, Rupp had made personal overtures to Unseld and Beard, routine for many recruiters, uncharacteristic for the Baron of basketball.
I think he felt that everything being equal, if a youngster had an opportunity to come and play at the University of Kentucky, you didn't really have to beg them. You just offered them the opportunity, and they would consider that an invitation to be a part of the greatest program in the United States at that time.
Recruiting was certainly not the highly scientific, you know, seduction that it is today. You know, either you wanted to play for Adolph Rupp or you didn't. You know, he wasn't going to sweet talk you into it.
Following UK's loss to Texas Western in the '66 NCAA championship game, it had become clear to most that the future of any successful college program included African-American athletes. Some basketball fans in the South, including Kentucky, were slow to embrace the change.
The resistance was there. The resistance was there with the displaying of the Confederate flag and with the playing of Dixie and even in terms of the lyrics of My Old Kentucky Home. You know, all of that, you know, was a determination on the part of whites to hold on to the old way. You know, we can't change. You know, we're fighting for a cause that our ancestors fought for years ago, and we're not going to surrender. And at the same time, you've got African Americans say, oh, yes, you will surrender. You know, yes, you will change. You know, we demand change. You'll change or else. You'll change here at the University of Kentucky, or else you will no longer win any other NCAA championships. You know, you'll change or you'll even start losing in the SEC, because change is coming. This train is moving whether or not you're willing to get on.
Perry Wallace had decided he would become the first to break the color barrier in the SEC, and it bothered him that Rupp did not make more of a personal pitch.
I wondered, how could I be ready to go place my life on the line when there was someone who was, you know, not willing to make personal contact with me.
After sitting out his first season, as all freshmen did at the time, Wallace began what would become an all-conference career. Playing basketball in the Deep South was every bit as daunting as he thought it would be, and more.
The Mississippi Alabama schools were always the harshest ones. And I mean, just outright, people just unleashed it. And there was nothing to hold them back. So much so that people back home listening to the game on the radio heard all the catcalls. Oh, they threatened your life. They threatened to lynch you, particularly because they knew that would, you know, in the Southern culture, threatening a black person with lynching or castrating you, the whole deal. We're going to kill you, and you know, on and on and on.
You know, there wasn't much enthusiasm on the other side for people to be the first African American, for one young man to be the first African American at Kentucky, and that's why Perry Wallace, I love Perry Wallace because he took that challenge at Vanderbilt, and every black player that has ever played in the SEC ought to write Perry Wallace a letter and say thank you for what you had to go through so that I was able to play in the SEC.
A strong student with supportive parents, Wallace also was a Sunday school teacher, and he found it ironic that he embraced the same Christian faith endorsed by many of the bigots hurling threats and insults.
I was the enemy, although they didn't know me personally and didn't know much of anything about me. But the great irony was that just what they had used to be strong in life and to be good in the ways that they were good were just the same things, precisely the same things.
Wallace says there was one place where basketball transcended matters of race, Lexington, Kentucky.
See, the quality of the play was so important. Those were just great. I mean, we were in the zone. I didn't even know the phrase in those days. They didn't have the phrase, I guess, but we were in the zone. You had great basketball, and you had people like Dan Issel and Mike Pratt, and so the quality of the game was so good, and I think that that really just lifted everybody to a wholly different level.
Coach Rupp really liked this guy, and Perry Wallace caused me some real issues with Coach Rupp because Coach Rupp didn't like the way I guarded Perry or the success we had. We won the games, but he was always on me about, doing something with Perry Wallace. Can't you guard him? And so later on, I played with Perry Wallace in an all-star game and saw him afterwards, and I joked about that and joked with him about it. I said, man, you caused me some problems as a Coach Rupp's on my butt,
Ironically, Rupp eventually did coach Perry Wallace in an all-star game once Wallace's college career had ended.
He was very, very nice. He offered to be helpful as he could in regard to the draft, speaking to scouts and that kind of thing, and that was striking.
Perry Wallace was named All-SEC as a senior. He went on to a successful law career and now teaches at American University in Washington, D.C. Rupp, meanwhile, resumed his search for the player he thought would be the right man to take the same step as Wallace, although his absentee recruiting methods were proving to be more of a hindrance in a time of social change.
With all that was on TV and in the newspaper, to be so disconnected, that's the tragedy, to be so disconnected from that, knowing that it exists, but perhaps in a state of denial that, one was not willing to look beyond their ego and their willingness and determination to win and say, hey, we've got a bigger problem here.
It was as if Rupp could make it happen. Maybe Rupp could have made it happen. But Rupp was a man born in Kansas in the 19th century. He came to Kentucky in 1930. His world was not Martin Luther King's world. He was not a social crusader. He was a basketball coach. I think it was too much to expect, too much to put on his shoulders to think that he should have been a social crusader in addition to being a basketball coach. Very few people have done both those.
It would be 3 more years before the University of Kentucky would sign a black basketball player. The years ticked by in the late 60s, and still there were no black basketball players on the Kentucky roster. Rupp had made overtures to a number of homegrown talents, including Felix Thruston, Jim McDaniels, and Hazard's Jim Rose, who, by some accounts, including Rupp's, verbally committed to the Wildcats.
The mayor of Hazard went down there and got him, brought him into my office. He sat in here and agreed to come to the University of Kentucky. The mayor was the happiest man that you have ever seen. The next morning, the mayor called me and was beside himself. The boy had signed to go to Western Kentucky. Now tell me that I didn't make an effort to get these boys? We did. We made every effort that we could.
I do recall his comments to the assistant coaches and saying, why can't we recruit these guys? Why is it that we can't convince them that if they came here, they'd be good basketball players, they could fit in and have a great career? I think he was frustrated simply because in his own mind, he's wondering, well, why would they not come play for me? And of course, he thought that about every player that any player in high school would want to play for him.
In fact, late in his career, Rupp complained openly about the evolution of the recruitment of athletes, both black and white.
No wonder they're spoiled. They get to them in high school already. Put them up on a pedestal. And you have to go, a head coach of a team has to go and beg a kid to come to school. If that isn't a hell of an arrangement. Beg a kid to take a $10,000 scholarship.
Meanwhile, African Americans on the UK campus demanded answers. Rupp, football coach Charlie Bradshaw, and athletics director Bernie Shively attended a public forum to discuss recruiting. UK President Dr. John Oswald kept pressing Rupp, demanding that he sign a black player. Again, Rupp balked.
He says, you're keeping us and probably jeopardizing us from getting all this federal help, which amounts to some $11 million. He says, we'll get someone. I don't care if he sits on the bench. I says, I'm not going to do that. I said, I'm not going to get someone, have him sit on the bench. I said, I don't recruit that way. When I recruit, I'm going to get someone that can play. And the only way I'm going to offer anybody a scholarship is if they can play.
And Dr. Oswald insisted that he have a black player, no matter if he could play or not. And that irked Rupp quite a bit.
One of the major changes taking place was how, African Americans wanted to define themselves. What do they want to be called? From colored to Negro to black. And so by the mid-1960s, it's black power. Say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud. And we don't want to be referred to as coloreds anymore or Negroes. But in interviews and from time to time, Coach Rupp would use the term colored or Negro. And this was seen as another form of resistance to the changes that were taking place.
Rupp's chief recruiter, Joe B. Hall, kept running into a different kind of resistance.
There was a concerted effort by several of the assistant coaches that I worked against to keep black players from coming to Kentucky. I mean, even black assistants for other colleges worked against us from getting black players. And I told one of them, I said, I can't imagine you not wanting to help us integrate our program, you being a black assistant.
But in 1969, the University of Kentucky finally signed its first African-American basketball player, Tom Paine, a 7-foot prep star from Louisville.
He was a tremendous prospect, just absolute 7 foot, 300 pound. I swear he must have had a 30-inch waist.
I mean, he could shoot outside. He could take you out like Issel did and shoot the 15, 18-foot shot. He could take you inside, and he was just a sophomore.
Of course, Tom, he thought that Adolph could do more to advance his pro career. That was his motivation.
Paine was an Army brat. He spent part of his childhood in Europe, so he knew little of the controversy swirling in the Deep South.
My mother and my father were not racist, and they never gave me any kind of racial perspective. And living on the Army base, I lived on Army bases most of my life, where whites and blacks intermingled. And so I never really got racism, in my background. I never heard nigger and all that little stuff. Now, that may be idyllic, but it's true.
Paine couldn't practice with the Wildcats as a freshman because of academic troubles, but by the time he was a sophomore, he was fully eligible and ready to begin playing for Adolph Rupp.
What I remember about Coach Rupp is I think I knew in my heart that he would play the best player at the time. And that's what I really worked for.
No amount of work, both on or off the court, could have prepared Paine for the abuse he was about to endure from opposing fans.
I couldn't believe it. I really couldn't. And, spit at him, throw things at him.
I never will forget Knoxville. I was really crushed up there. I heard the coons and the other things that I was called. I heard the heckles and stuff like that.
Knoxville really surprised me because, we'd come out of the dressing room and he had to come right by the Tennessee crowd, and they were just unmerciful on him, just, using the N-word and cussing him and everything. And I'd question whether I'd want to, if I'd been black, to play, go down south.
They were throwing ice and they were spitting out of the stands, and they were quite vocal. I can't remember anything in particular because they like to focus on my father as well as Tom, but it was pretty bad. I mean, it was rough. My wife and I were right there at the entrance when the team was coming off, and we were starting to step out, and there was such a barrage of things being thrown that we had to step back in, and the kids were coming out with, as I say, Coke dripping off them and things like that. It was pretty bad.
Well, I remember one place where they just shook his fist at the crowd. They were razzing. It was a bad place down south.
And we went down to play Louisiana State, and it was terrible, the way they hollered and screamed and yelled at Tom Paine. And Coach Rupp was infuriated.
We bonded that game because they were unmerciful on him. They spit on us coming out the tunnel.
That's what I've been understanding about life, that sometimes when you're put in a position, you have to have the wherewithal to go through the process, you see. And if you understand that, you're better able to. Jackie Robinson understood it. Tom Paine didn't understand it. I just felt that I was being rejected on some level, and it hurt, and I wasn't strong enough to deal with it.
Today, Paine says he harbors no ill will at anyone who hurled insults, and he has a profound admiration for his coach.
I love Adolph Rupp because of one thing. Adolph Rupp put me out on that court when the time came. And if you go back and look at the newspapers, a lot of people, I don't think necessarily wanted me to go out on that court at the time.
There was an enormous amount of pressure put on him by some of the local bigots not to play Tom Paine.
Vaughn said prior to Payne's first varsity game with the Wildcats playing at Northwestern, some of Rupp's friends and confidants tried to talk the coach out of starting the 7-foot sophomore in favor of an all-white starting five.
And Joe Hall and I stayed up and we talked about it. Finally, Joe went to bed. I don't guess I went to bed till 4 o'clock in the morning. And but I knew Coach Rupp was going to do what was right, and he did what was right. He played Tom Paine. He started Tom Paine.
Adolph Rupp showed some kind of courage. And I just love Adolph Rupp right now, where I'm at now. And I'm not saying that in any kind of way. Is because when I see pictures of me sitting beside him on the bench, it makes me feel good.
The Wildcats prospered during their first and what turned out to be their only season with Tom Paine, winning 22 games in the SEC championship. After that 1 year, Paine, who already was a husband and a father, declared hardship and signed with the NBA's Atlanta Hawks.
When Tom Paine went pro after sophomore year, that hurt Adolph because he said, there goes my chance for another national championship. So he was thinking not of what color that player is, can he play?
At that time, I didn't really understand what I was doing. I didn't understand who I was in Kentucky history. And had I understand who I was and like I understand now, I would have stayed and I would have kept continuing to play and battle it out, you know.
He would spend just one season in the NBA. This is Tom Paine's world today, the Green River Correctional Complex in Central City, Kentucky. After his rookie season, he was arrested and jailed on a rape charge. He was paroled in the early 80s and moved to California, where Paine was arrested and convicted of rape again. After serving 14 years, he was returned to Kentucky and sentenced to another 15 years for violating his parole. When he talks about his college career, Paine still calls the Wildcats "we." In fact, he says, being a part of Kentucky's storied basketball tradition helped get him through some tough times during his incarceration.
I've been at the verge of almost wanting to take my own life. I've been so emotionally distraught and despondent to the point of where I used to go in my cell and cry every night. Because of the whole thing. My mom was hurt, my children growing up without a daddy, not representing my state like I'm supposed to, the opportunities that I let go. It's very painful. And one of the ways I've made it is because I bonded with that.
With the Wildcats?
Yeah.
You still find pride in it?
Yeah.
He's had a lot of time to think about UK basketball, his place in history, and his coach.
I'm going to hold Coach Rupp. I'm going to hold Kentucky in esteem, and because I had an opportunity there. I did something historic there. It's a legacy for my grandson.
Adolph Rupp relinquished his job after the 1971-72 season, forced to step down at age 70 by the school's mandatory retirement policy. He died 5 years later. But his persona gradually would take on new life as the relevance of the Kentucky-Texas Western game grew with each passing decade.
We were not aware of any of the revisionist history until 1991, the 25th anniversary of this particular game. And it caught us totally by surprise because They were manufacturing a story that didn't exist.
1991 is when Sports Illustrated published a story marking the 25th anniversary of the 1966 NCAA championship game, matching Rupp's runs with Texas Western. The article, written by Curry Kirkpatrick, more than implied that Rupp had played the race card with his team in the hours leading up to tip-off. Wrote Kirkpatrick, Rupp usually was a charming PR rogue, brimming with diplomacy and psychology. Regrettably, his politics leaned more toward the KKK. To a man, Rupp's players deny it ever happened. Texas Western coach Don Haskins has admitted to telling his players he knew Rupp had made condescending racial comments to his team prior to the game. Haskins since has distanced himself from those remarks, but burnished by time, it has become fact in the minds of many.
Everything I've ever read about Adolph Rupp seemed to have been written by people who had no idea who Adolph Rupp was, who could never have been around him, never spent an hour talking to him, but are dealing with the parody, dealing with the caricature. They're dealing with a cardboard cutout of who they think Adolph Rupp was. Rupp has been transformed into a symbol of racism that he never was.
But all of a sudden, this is such an easy story. It really is a story in black and white in the minds of people who weren't there, that becomes such an easy story to portray, to dramatize. The facts tend to muddy that because there was a lot of gray.
I was there 4 years. I never ever got any hint at all from him that he was that. One thing coaches can't do is they can't lie to players. Players know coaches.
They didn't know him. And a lot of people that talk about him and write about him, they weren't born when he was alive.
I don't think that the people that are revisiting the world back then had any knowledge about what college sports was about or the world was about at that time. So I think he's an easy target. He's not here to defend himself, and many of his peers are gone.
As college basketball grew in popularity, Rupp's reputation as a villain grew with it. In his book, Rupp as I Knew Him, former assistant Harry Lancaster claimed Rupp used a racial slur in complaining that University President John Oswald wanted the basketball program integrated. It was a remembrance that didn't add up, given the fact that Rupp had backed previous President Frank Dickey's move to integrate the entire Southeastern Conference in the late 50s. Seth Davis of Sports Illustrated wrote, Adolph Rupp was the game's George Wallace when it came to integrating black players. For most of his career, Rupp fought tooth and nail against the inclusion of blacks into the game. Said Rick Cantu of the New York Times, Adolph Rupp once declared he would never let a black player wear Kentucky blue. As writers began to quote each other, it was torture for Rupp's family members who at one point considered legal action only to find you cannot defame the dead.
You have stories written by sports writers who were not alive in those days. You've been written by people who didn't know my father, who didn't live in the South, who didn't understand any of the situation. They just pick up a idea and run with it.
That's just not right, and it's unfair. The man doesn't have a chance to make a retort. He is, and the family really doesn't have a chance to make a retort. And that's really not fair to a fellow that certainly doesn't deserve that, and a family that doesn't deserve that, and a university that doesn't deserve that.
I don't understand how they can pick this thing up and run with it when there is absolutely not one iota of truth in it from a standpoint of actions or words by my father to give any legitimacy to this.
I know his son has carried that stigma along with him.
Jim Tucker, the Paris, Kentucky native who landed a college scholarship on Rupp's recommendation in 1950.
I had an opportunity to call him to tell him the same story that I just told you about what his father did for me, and he said that has done him a world of good because no one had ever said anything of a positive nature about his father, and he was so happy that I would come forward and say something about Mr. Rupp.
In the book, Let Me Tell You a Story, written by John Feinstein, legendary Celtics coach Red Auerbach tells of their friendship and dismisses the notion that Rupp was a segregationist. He said, "All I ever hear from people is that he was a racist. You know what? He did hate black guys who couldn't play. He also hated white guys who couldn't play, blue guys who couldn't play, and green guys who couldn't play, and Muslims who couldn't play. That was it. All these people who never met the guy said he was a racist. I knew the guy."
When I used to draft and did most of the scouting, in fact, all the scouting, I never went to a draft meeting without calling him up. And we go for an hour or so on the telephone. Who do you like and why? I always used to try to draft as many boys as I could from Kentucky.
Auerbach said that he didn't care, Adolph didn't care if they were red, if they were green, if they were yellow, if they were black, if they were white. He just wanted basketball players that could win. You know, and I truly believe that.
Had Rupp moved more quickly to desegregate his team, as former UK President John Oswald urged, perhaps he could have avoided much of the criticism leveled at him before and especially after he died.
As I look back on it, we probably could have made a stronger effort to recruit black players back then. Certainly, we were in the forefront, and should have been. I mean, we were the best college basketball team in the country. We were the best college program in the country. And if there was anybody who was going to take a leadership position, it would have been the University of Kentucky and Coach Rupp. But you know, when you look back on it, I mean, he was successful. I mean, he was winning games. He was winning 20 or more every year. He just didn't want to change a whole lot.
Well, there ought to have been some things that were in place to sort of raise the eyebrow of a parent or an athlete. Say, well, you know, I see some changes, but, you know, there was no evidence that there was change taking place here. You know, not only on the basketball court, but elsewhere. We couldn't see change. And so, you know, if you don't see it anywhere else, well, why can I expect it, you know, in Memorial Coliseum?
Some of those who actually lived and worked through the troubled decade of the 60s have a different perspective of the time and the man.
Actually experiencing the culture and the society the way it was, not the way that it ought to be or the way somebody thinks it might have been, but the way it was. And certainly he was a product of his time.
If Coach Rupp was a racist, and I don't know whether he was or not, I don't know what was in Coach Rupp's heart. All I know are the facts. My personal experiences, things I've read, things I witnessed, things I know. And that, to me, is the only fair way to deal with the situation.
The greatest failure in all of this stuff is to try to apply today's standards to another era. You know, if you're talking about a difference of 40 years, if you're talking about a whole generation, I don't think you can say that the way the world is today is the way it should have been 40 years ago. Maybe we all should have been Martin Luther King, but there was only one of him.
He was so big that it was left to him to be the person to segregate the South in intercollegiate sports, or be the person to go out and recruit, you know, the first black player. And he tried to do those things.
I believe his hands were tied. He wanted to win. And I believe if he could have put a monkey in a suit to win a ball game, he would have done that. But he wanted to win. And still there are people who believe that he was a bigot. I don't think so.
Neil Reed, the ex-Kentucky assistant who spearheaded the recruitment of black players in the early 60s, visited Rupp in the final stages of the coach's life.
He said we were selfish. He said he and I were selfish. We wanted it for the social advancement. And we were selfish in that we were willing to put Wesley, just as the 3 kids in Philadelphia that were bulldozed over, we were willing to put Wesley's life on the line for us to be successful in integration.
He didn't care. He just wanted to win games. He would win games however he could win games. That's why I'm still waiting for somebody to show me that he turned his back on a black player who would have helped him win games.
People who didn't know him went through the myth and the legend and all the rumors more than anything else, and did not go directly to people who knew Adolph. Because if you talk to those people that were close to him, he was very concerned about, about race. He was very concerned about segregation. He's very concerned about, when is it going to happen, in the South.
He was a man with a really big heart, and a person who was very charitable, and a person that would help everybody.
Let's not define Coach Rupp by a 1966 game. Let's define him about that at the end of his life, he was progressive and he even had affection for me. You see what I'm saying? Let's define him and let's look at where that went to. Let's look at what's become of that. Let's look at where we're at now.
In a building named for Adolph Rupp, the University of Kentucky plays just as it did when he was coaching at the highest level. Today's roster is made up primarily of African Americans.
Just seeing how more diverse the squad is now, and everybody seems to be behind the team. I still believe, however, that shadow of Adolph Rupp is still casting across the University of Kentucky, whether people like it or not, in this sort of negative light.
UK, not only UK, Dick, but I think the entire state of Kentucky has suffered unfairly for the way this whole Rupp situation has been misrepresented. It has given us a stigma that we don't deserve to have. And there are still some African-American, older African-Americans who will never be Kentucky fans because of what they believe to be true about Rupp.
A lot of the young people are not aware of it. They just want to be on national television, but that generation that was here is, still alive and doing well and has not forgotten. And, African Americans have a long memory, and, they share those things, with their children. And, people still ask me, how's it going over there? As if the University of Kentucky is like a distant island, even when it's right here, in the midst of Lexington. And so, that disconnect is still very present, 40-some years later.
Helping to close the gap is the head coach, hired in 1997. The athletics director at the time, C.M. Newton, believed he was the best man for the job.
The fact that race wasn't a consideration in the hiring of Tubby, I think speaks volumes, but then the fact that he's been so accepted. And much of that is Tubby. He's a very unique and special man, as is Donna, but it also speaks well for people. We're looking at people as people and not based necessarily on the color of their skin.
When he investigated and looked around, saw my background and saw the things and how I conducted myself and how I handled myself, he knew I could handle this situation. And whether I was black or white, I think didn't make much difference to him. It was whether I could do the job or not.
I think that that's one of the greatest things that's ever happened in Kentucky. And Tubby Smith, without question, is likened to Martin Luther King when it comes to the basketball world.
I wrote him a letter, okay? And I told him, it was the greatest thing that ever happened in the state of Kentucky. Now, it's not going to be the easiest thing for you, but it's the greatest thing that ever happened.
Tubby's doing it the right way. I think his kids represent the school and the state the way that my father would want them to represent the state and the school. And I think there's no question about it. He'd be very proud of Tubby.
I think they're kind of cut out of the same cloth, in my opinion. I mean, Tubby makes them go to school, makes them behave. If they don't, they can go someplace else and play.
He's following in the kind of the footsteps of success that Adolph first laid down. I think that's what Adolph wanted. Adolph wanted to create a kingdom, and he did.
Now that he's gotten the long-term contract, and I think that the state now understands he's going to be there for a while. Okay, this is our guy. Let's embrace him. Let's see if let's see if he can continue this tradition for the next 4 or 5 years. And that's very good to see, because of the mere fact that, in a sense, he's a pioneer and he doesn't even know it.
And right now at the University of Kentucky, the program is as great as it's ever been. And the greatest irony in the whole story is that, Tubby, Smith is black. And already has won an NCAA championship. And so, history has always proven that if you will pay attention to what happened to you in the past and what you are about and where you came from, then you can be even greater in the future.
All Kentuckians care so much about the university and about their program, and that's whether you're black or white, that I think it took a lot of people where they had to kind of look inside themselves and say, does this really make a difference? I think the answer by the real Kentucky fan was, whoever our coach is, we're going to support them if they're green, purple dot, polka dot or whatever.
It's an honor and it's a privilege, and I carry this, knowing that I am a black man representing not just a race, but representing the Wildcat Nation, representing the University of Kentucky, and what we stand for here, and I just and promoting all the virtues that this university and this community and this state has to offer around the nation, around the world.
Unfortunately for Tubby or any other coach, it all boils down to one word, and that's win.
On January 19, 2005, Kentucky played Ole Miss in Oxford, Mississippi. 9 out of 10 starters were black. There were 2 black head coaches, and it was just another basketball game on a crisp winter night.
Oh, it's a given now. It's a given. And thank God. I look at it. Thank God.
C.M. Newton at Alabama played 5 black players at Alabama first, I think, in the SEC. He was one of Adolph's players, certainly one of Adolph's acolytes. So when you see it today, it's normal. It's normal everywhere, and it's a good thing to see that poison that existed in the 60s has been drained out of it.
Gradually it was going to come. And of course, once it came, it was a tidal wave. And now we have so many quality black athletes playing in the South, really good ones. And coaches.
You look at Alabama, you look at Mississippi's teams, you look at Georgia's teams, and they're predominantly black. And those kids don't have a clue how this all turned around. If Perry Wallace hadn't done what he did, they wouldn't even have been there,
It was a tidal wave triggered the day Wallace signed. He says occasionally he finds himself talking to Southerners who admit they were less than accepting when he became the SEC's first black player.
What happens is that I appreciate what's going on when we meet. The circles, our circles are rounding out. And so I understand that. And whenever it happens, I appreciate how important it is.
Circles are eternal, and it's likely the debate about Adolph Rupp will be as well. He was a man some believe should have done more, who used racially insensitive language at a time it was becoming socially unacceptable, but also, according to those who knew him best, a man who did try to effect change the best way he knew how.
I paid strict attention to my own business, and if you do that, you get along. I didn't try to step on anyone else's toes, and I didn't try to run over anybody, and I didn't try to demand any attention or anything like that. I just went along and got my knitting needle and went to knitting.
He started pushing the Southeastern Conference to desegregate in the late 50s and early 60s, and when word of his intentions swept through the South, he had his life threatened. Still, so many have chosen to define him by one basketball game. At least future generations now have more facts to consider about the Baron of basketball, Adolph Rupp.